I don't know how many of you have ever watched a flock of chickens, but there's actually been research done that shows that there is a definite pecking order with a flock of chickens. Whichever one is, at the top of the group, and that hen doesn't like what another one of the chickens has done, she will go over and kind of put it in line, and that chicken may try and fight back in some way, but when they realize that they're not at the top of the pecking order, then they go to a chicken that's below them, and so forth. You can see the pecking order, that there's someone that's on the bottom, and there's no one or no other chicken left for that one on the bottom to pick on. Have you ever watched a group of teenagers in a cafeteria for lunch? There's a definite pecking order that goes on there as well. Now, the kids at the top of the pecking order may not pick on those that are under them, but at the same time, they know the ones that are above them and the ones that are under them, and they don't do anything to necessarily lift someone up to their level. It's important to protect where they are in the pecking order, and so they do all that they can to maintain that order, to maintain their security. Now, I would like to say that pecking order thing is, you outgrow it after adolescence. But all I have to do to validate the fact that this pecking order thing continues is to go to a gathering of pastors. And, that same pecking order thing is in order in terms of, people are not necessarily putting others down, but they're also not doing anything to help pull them up, because it's important for them to maintain their position in the pecking order. You can put your own profession, you can put your own places of gathering. You know what I'm talking about in terms of that pecking order. But as we look at this morning's scripture reading found in the book of Exodus, we see that Pharaoh is on top. He's on the top of his kingdom, and he doesn't want to do anything to affect the order of things. He wants to make sure that he stays on top. And so when Moses asked Pharaoh to let God's people go, Pharaoh's response is to kind of turn up the heat, to become more heavy-handed in order to protect his position. Pharaoh's power, in a sense, is being challenged by God. Now, I'm going to be telling you most of the story today because it's found over the course of about 5 or 6 chapters in the book of Exodus. I'd encourage you to take time this week and actually read these chapters. They're Exodus chapter 7 through Exodus chapter 12. But I'm going to tell you the story rather than read it to you this morning. But some people may even ask the question, why should we be concerned about these Old Testament stories? Because after all, we are New Testament people. There seems to be no connection for many people between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But actually, the Old Testament and the New Testament are actually one story. They're God's story. They're not two separate stories, but they're a story that when you put the Old Testament and the story of the New Testament together, what it equals is God's story. And so during this season of Lent, as we're preaching on some of these Old Testament stories, it's an issue that we're trying to lay some foundations to help understand how these Old Testament stories connect with the New Testament story of Jesus' death and resurrection. Last week, Pastor Alex started with the story of Moses and the burning bush. Moses was born to a Hebrew slave girl. Now, whenever you hear us talking about the Hebrew people, or hear us talking about the children of Israel, or talking about the descendants of Abraham, those are all the same people, or even the Jews. those are all references to the same group of people. So the Hebrews, the children of Israel, descendants of Abraham, the Jews, those are not four different groups of people, but they're all referring to the same group. Moses should have been thrown in the river and drowned as a baby, but instead he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And so what happened was, as baby Moses grew up actually it was more than just his growing up, but for the first 40 years of his life, he lived in a place and position of privilege inside Pharaoh's palace. By all rights, first of all, he shouldn't have lived, but even if he lived, he should have been amongst the Hebrew slaves. But instead, he grew up in Pharaoh's palace. It's important to recognize that as Moses, went to speak to Pharaoh, it wasn't like he was meeting a stranger. When Moses went to Pharaoh's palace to talk to Pharaoh, he was actually talking to a childhood friend. The one who was Pharaoh at the time was probably a childhood friend, grew up in the same palace that Moses did, and so they played together as children. They grew up to be young men and adults together. Maybe they were even rivals at times. But as Moses went in to speak to Pharaoh, he wasn't walking into Pharaoh's court a stranger, because they had a history. They had probably grown up together. Moses was assisted by his brother Aaron, and they were asked to go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh to let God's people go, to let the Hebrew slaves go, and to go out into the mountain, actually the same mountain where Moses saw the burning bush, to go to that mountain and worship God. Now, Pharaoh was at the top of the pecking order. He was at the top of the heap, and so when Moses asked that he let God's people go out to worship for 3 days, Pharaoh was risking a lot. It was an issue, first of all, it was slave labor. And so if they gave the slaves a 3-day holiday, think about all the work that would be lost. Think about the economic impact. It was also an issue, it was a risk to let them go. What if they didn't return? Pharaoh recognized that there was all sorts of risks that he would be running. And when you're on the top of the heap, you don't want to do anything to risk someone else rising to the top of the heap. So when Moses and Aaron said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," Pastor Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot. What was Pharaoh's response when they said, "Let my people go"?
Maybe. He said no.
He said no, and probably said it rather emphatically, and maybe with his arms crossed.
Yes, more exclamation points. So no.
Okay, so he was quite forceful that he wasn't going to let them go. Well, it was really an issue of Pharaoh protecting his position, keeping people under his thumb, under his control. Pharaoh was in charge, and he didn't want to do anything to appear weak. He felt that his authority was being challenged by Moses and by Aaron. Maybe even felt challenged by Moses' God. And so his response was a heavy hand in not letting them go. The other thing that was going on at this point was many people saw Pharaoh as God. Pharaoh probably acted himself as if he were God, and so if they wanted to worship anyone, he thought they should be worshiping him, not going out to some mountain someplace to worship Yahweh, to worship Moses as God. Well, Moses returned to Pharaoh several times, making the request to have the children of Israel go out to the mountain to worship. But every time, Pharaoh's response to Moses was no.